Oh yeah, I recently added a playlist to my channel. My buddy Solomon Nelson, who does some fantastic videos taking down the cretins in this industry. He deserves the exposure. Go check him out.
I like reviewing training programs. So much so that 4 months ago, I made a video critically reviewing Jeff Nippard's bench press specialization program. I argued that it was a terrible program for a number of reasons, including the fact that its week 4 day 1 workout was quite literally impossible. Jeff himself replied to my video, thanking me in the comments for my feedback and agreeing that his bench program was in need of an update owing to some of the criticisms I made. I'll put our correspondence on screen. The defenses he made of his routine were unconvincing. I outlined why in my response, but he still broadly agreed with me, at least to the extent that he thought my criticisms were worthy of a program overhaul, which was big of him, and I appreciate that he went out of his way to respond to me at all. In fact, I was so impressed by Jeff's conduct that I decided to send him an email offering to review his other programs privately and free of charge. However, it's been a few months now and still no reply. Perhaps he just didn't read my email. So I guess I'll just keep making videos like these. That brings me to the topic of this video, which is I'm going to review critically a program that Jeff wrote with his wife Stephanie Buttermore, that being the Women's Specialization program. Specialization in what exactly? I wondered the same thing, since usually you say what you're specializing in. You follow a biceps specialization routine to emphasize biceps growth, or a bench press specialization routine to emphasize your bench press strength. So what's a women's specialization routine? I guess the concept is that it specializes in women, which is half as bad as saying that it specializes in humans. Well, the program is advertised on both Jeff and Stephanie's website as one that emphasizes glutes, shoulders, abs, and back. So it's predominantly a bodybuilding or physique program that focuses on developing certain muscle groups. Additionally, it's advertised as appropriate not for beginners, but rather for intermediate and advanced trainees, so women with considerable experience in the weight room. Before I explain why this program is bad, it's important to reiterate why I focus on Jeff and Stephanie's bad program when there are so many other bad training programs that you can buy online. And the reason is this. Unlike Joe Sixpack's 6-week shred program or whatever, Jeff and Stephanie purport to be evidence-based. They usually are, and they let you know it too. In fact, on Stephanie's website, she writes in all caps that her program is backed by science and will elevate your current training to an advanced, structured level supported by the most up-to-date scientific literature. Additionally, she urges in all caps that you train smarter and stop wasting your time. The implication, of course, being that if you buy her program and follow it, then you'll be training smarter and won't be wasting time. Never mind training smarter. Let's talk writing smarter for the moment. PRs shouldn't have an apostrophe. Instead, it should be written like this, because we want to indicate PRs plural, not possessive. Anyway, when you purport to be so strongly evidence-based like Jeff and Stephanie do, and then proceed to release bad programs, then that leads to two undesirable consequences. Number one, you undermine people's faith in evidence-based fitness. Or number two, you convince people that their genetics suck, or they've reached a plateau, they're not cut out for lifting, whatever, because they can't progress on a program that purports to be backed by the most up-to-date scientific literature. So, the stakes are high. Here's what I'll argue in the following 3 chapters. Number 1. The Women's Specialization program is simply bad for its stated goals. Number 2. Inasmuch as this program is evidence-based, there's a dearth of scientific evidence for the various programmatic decisions, counter to the claims made in the advertising. And 3. The upper body workouts are as good as plagiarized. Quick caveat, I have to say that the version of Jeff and Stephanie's program that I'll be reviewing in this video may not be the most recent iteration. It's possible that they went ahead and changed it after I sent Jeff my email telling him the program had problems. I just don't know. Without further ado, let's get to the meat and potatoes. I'll make 4 main criticisms of the lower body training. Number 1, inbuilt junk volume. Number 2, excessive volume. Number 3, excessive frequency. And number 4, excessively high rep sets. This program has inbuilt junk volume. Let's define junk volume before we proceed. In fact, let's let Jeff, since Jeff Nippard himself has an excellent video about it, so I'll let him do that work for me.
Junk volume refers to any training you do that takes up time and energy, but has no actual benefit in terms of muscle or strength gain. The junk is garbage. It's not actually worth anything. The next type of junk volume that I want to look at is easy sets. And I do think this is the most common and most pernicious type of junk volume that there is, at least in commercial gyms and with more casual lifters. But if this type of volume dominates your routine, you might have a hard time getting past the beginner to early intermediate stage.
One easy way that junk volume can be introduced into a program is if both the weights you're lifting and the reps you're performing for an exercise are fixed. And that's because you need to come close to failure for a set not to be junk volume. Jeff and Stephanie admit as much when on page 57 they write that training near failure is a necessary prerequisite for optimizing hypertrophy. Anyway, the corollary here is that in order to come close to failure, the stronger you get, either the reps done with any given weight have to go up over time, or the weight done for any given rep target has to go up. So if you've got room to progress in weight or reps, and yet you're always lifting the exact same weights for the exact same reps, then by definition, you'll eventually be doing junk volume, since as you get stronger and stronger, your sets with fixed rep and weight targets will become further and further and further away from failure over time, such that eventually they'll be junk volume. For this reason, I call fixed rep and weight targets inbuilt junk volume, and there's no good reason for a bodybuilding program to include it. That brings me to the following question. Does Jeff and Stephanie's program have inbuilt junk volume? The answer is yes, and a lot of it. Consider lower body 1. Bicycle crunch, 3 sets of 15 to 20 at RPE 8. Lower body 2. Knee-banded bodyweight hip thrust, 3 sets of 25 to 30 at RPE 8. Lateral band walk, 3 sets of 20 at RPE 8. Upper body 1. Close grip push-ups, 3 sets of 8 to 10 at RPE 7. Lower body 3. Deficit bodyweight Bulgarian split squat, 3 sets of 10 to 12 at RPE 7. Body weight reverse hyperextension, 3 sets of 15 to 20 at RPE 8. Band seated hip abduction, 3 sets of 25 to 30 at RPE 8. Hollow body hold, 3 sets of 15 seconds at RPE 7. Lower body 4. Body weight walking lunge, 2 sets of 12 to 15 at RPE 7. Knee banded body weight hip thrust, 4 sets of 15 to 20 at RPE 8. Swiss ball leg curl, 3 sets of 8 to 12 at RPE 7. These are all exercises where a fixed weight, namely either your own body weight or a resistance band, and a fixed rep target are given. This makes them inbuilt junk volume, because even if you just so happen to be neither too strong nor too weak, that these rep prescriptions with body weight fall within an appropriate proximity to failure, you'll eventually outgrow these prescriptions by design if you have any room to progress. Fortunately for Jeff and Stephanie, this issue of inbuilt junk volume has 2 easy fixes. Either 1, ditch the rep targets for these exercises and only give RPE targets. That way, proximity to failure is always ensured, because the reps will just fall where they naturally should. Or 2, Change the exercises to ones where you can add weight to progress within a fixed rep range. However, as written, the abundance of junk volume makes this program terrible. At best, most of this training is just a waste of time, contrary to Stephanie's suggestion on her website that you won't be wasting time following this program. At worst, in Jeff's own words, this may have you struggling to get beyond the intermediate stage.
But if this type of volume dominates your routine, you might have a hard time getting past the beginner to early intermediate stage.
This program has too much volume, defined as the number of hard sets per week you do, for the glutes. Yes, a specialization routine should raise the volume of training for the few muscles it targets. But there's a difference between adding, say, 10 hard sets on top of what you'd normally do in a week, and adding 40. Doing more than 20 hard sets per week for any muscle is already pushing it, even when specializing. Going above 30 is extreme, and the argument that going this high could ever be a net benefit to you is flimsy in almost all cases, and you'd probably need to be under the watchful eye of a careful, rational coach to do it safely. Above 40 sets, 50 sets per week? Forget it. No well-conducted study hitherto has demonstrated statistically significant benefits in going that high. That brings me to the following question. How many hard sets per week do you do for the glutes in Jeff and Stephanie's women's specialization program? And I'm going to count any exercise that involves a high degree of tension in hip extension or hip abduction, which are both functions that the glutes perform, such that either the glute maximus or minimus could reasonably be expected to be the first or very close to the first muscle to fail for a given exercise pushed all the way to failure as a glutes exercise. That's my criteria. So in addition to obvious glutes isolation exercises, such as hip thrusts and lateral band walks, this designation also includes lunges, Bulgarian split squats, barbell back squats, Romanian deadlift, as counting toward weekly glutes volume. So how many sets is it? I'll let you conjure some numbers in your head for a few seconds. You can go ahead and type your best guess in the comment. The answer is 54. You don't need to do this much volume for great or even optimal results. If anything, going this high is counterproductive, not only because it can directly lead to worse progress, either via overtraining or not pushing sufficiently hard on your sets, but also indirectly, by virtue of the fact that you'll end up living in the gym, and you'll probably make yourself more susceptible to injury. I've enumerated the risks in doing too much volume elsewhere, so I won't repeat what I've said, what I've already argued, in fact, here. But you can check out my video debunking Mike Israetel's terrible advice to train more than the pros for a better idea. And as stated earlier, doing this much volume isn't even evidence-based. I'll come back to that in Chapter 3. But let me add some helpful anecdotes. My sister can rep out bodyweight chin-ups from a dead hang, and I don't train her even remotely close to the sorts of volumes that Jeff and Stephanie recommend. And even if I wanted her to train that much, and I don't, I wouldn't be able to due to time constraints. She does 3 workouts a week because she's doing a PhD. Lyle McDonald coached Sumi Singh. I've interviewed her on the channel, check that out, to set world records in powerlifting, and she didn't do more than like 24 sets a week for glutes at any point in time. So overall, Jeff and Stephanie's program confuses more with better, and instead it should emphasize quality over quantity. Frequency is how often you hit a body part per week. In Jeff and Stephanie's program, the lower body is trained hard 4 days a week. In a vacuum, I suppose I don't have an inherent problem with high-frequency programs. I think they can be done right, and they can be done right as long as you understand the interplay between volume, intensity, and frequency. If you want to push frequency very high, then volume and intensity for any given training day need to be brought down commensurately so that you don't blow yourself up with excessive training and get injured. Some programs do this fine. One example being Pavel Tsatsulin's Greasing the Groove, where you do fairly easy sub-maximal training throughout the day, most days, and then you retest your maxes every now and again to ensure that progressive overload is taking place. And I suppose I can hardly knock that system when so many bodyweight only lifters have achieved success with it. However, Jeff and Stephanie's program doesn't do high frequency right, because it just doesn't correctly reconcile volume, intensity, and frequency. Because every day that you train your lower body, you're nuking it. You're doing set after set after set, low reps, high reps, isolation lifts, compound lifts, barbells, cables, machines, bodyweight, bands. You name it, it's there. Like all within a close proximity to failure, at least on paper. And you're supposed to do this 4 days a week and on consecutive days, which means your joints are hardly getting a rest. This is just an injury waiting to happen, whether it be a hip or knee tendinopathy or some kind of muscle strain, unless you happen to be a genetic freak whose joints are made of steel. Overall, the high frequency is just another case of Jeff and Stephanie confusing more with better. This program is in many ways a product of its time, and by that I mean it came out around when some research had emerged challenging the notion that there's a so-called bodybuilding rep range of like 8 to 12 rep or 6 to 15 rep sets or whatever, and that there's equivalent hypertrophy for sets of up to 30 reps compared to sets of lower reps, as long as the proximity to muscular failure is the same. So when this research emerged, a lot of people in the evidence-based sphere started doing super high rep sets, prescribing them, and touting their benefits. But fortunately today, I think people are taking a more nuanced look at this and are asking, like, why would you do a set of 30 to failure when instead you could do a set of 8 to failure? Because even if the resulting muscle growth is the same, with a set of 30 to failure, you have to go through something like 26 exhausting reps before you get to the truly growth-stimulating ones. Whereas with a set of 8 to failure, you only have to go through like 4. So why would you do very high rep sets close to failure when sets of lower reps close to failure are far less mentally exhausting and yield the same growth? Well, there are some good reasons why you might want to, but they're context dependent, such as with, for example, an injury that's exacerbated by lifting heavy. But evidently, injury isn't Jeff and Stephanie's concern when they prescribe such high rep sets, because in addition to the sets of 25 to 30, they also prescribe heavy sets of 4 on squats and deadlifts. This tells me that the high rep sets are there somewhat arbitrarily, not because they have any special growth promoting benefits that go above and beyond heavier lifting. Here, you could say that Jeff and Stephanie are only being evidence-based to the extent that, like, yes, there's evidence showing that high reps are hypertrophic. That doesn't mean it's at all rational to include such an abundance of them in a program for intermediate to advanced women in the general population. Which brings me to the next chapter of this video. Stephanie claims on her website that the women's specialization is backed by science and is at the most advanced, structured level supported by the most up-to-date scientific literature. This claim is false. Let me go through some of the programmatic decisions and unsubstantiated claims to explain why. On page 62, Jeff and Stephanie give their rationale for why the lower body is trained 4 times a week and on consecutive days, while the upper body is trained a relatively few 2 times a week. They write, "This program uses a lower-lower-upper split, meaning the lower body will be trained 4 times per week, and the upper body will be trained 2 times per week. Because women have an overall increased ability to recover, and tend to have both more lower body strength relative to upper body strength, this split is ideal for women in the intermediate to advanced training stage." Why would increased strength mean you should train more frequently? If anything, it's the opposite. That is, bigger, stronger muscles need more recovery, not less. What we see in the real world, and not theory land, and not that this bizarre claim of Jeff and Stephanie's is even based on any sound theory, is that the stronger you get, the less frequently you can train a given body part and still recover. For instance, Ray Williams, he had a higher raw squat than anyone else in history, and he didn't squat more than like once a week. My TF2 friend, Andrew Ott, he's a freak, by the way. Shout out to Andrew Ott. Love that guy. He squatted 800 pounds at age 18. I think drug-free as well at the time. Training the squat just once a week. These guys would break training their legs 4 times a week. So that's absolute strength. Well, what about relative strength? Well, what do we see in competitive powerlifting? High-frequency benching routines are pretty common, but what about high-frequency deadlifting? Very uncommon. Why is that? There are lower absolute loads involved in the bench compared to the deadlift, on average. There are weaker, smaller muscles involved in the bench compared to the deadlift. I hope you see where I'm going with this. So, if anything, Jeff and Stephanie have it the wrong way around when they argue that the upper body should be trained less frequently because it's relatively weaker than the lower body in women compared to men. You can make the argument that women should train with higher frequencies on average compared to men, but not that they should train their lower bodies more frequently than their upper bodies.
If you have the lower body, if you have the lower body, it's easy to. If you have the lower body,
dude, I just woke up. I don't want to have a aneurysm.
Well, just let me say, if you have a
Please
lower
don't explain that again.
lower body, it's easy to build a top body. You have a upper body and no legs, you got a problem.
On page 68, Jeff and Stephanie give a justification for the inclusion of the very high rep sets. They write, very high rep sets can provide a massive hypertrophic stimulus through large volumes and significant metabolic stress with low loads. I went to the study they gave as support for this claim. Neuromuscular adaptations after 2 and 4 weeks of 80% versus 30% 1 repetition maximum resistance training to failure by Jenkins et al. Where the authors say something a little more guarded in the form of resistance training to failure at 80 versus 30% 1RM elicited similar muscle hypertrophy. So inasmuch as very high rep sets can provide a massive hypertrophic stimulus, they provide no more of a massive hypertrophic stimulus compared to heavier lifting. So I don't know about Jeff and Stephanie's use of the adjective massive here. The only thing that causes a massive hypertrophic stimulus in intermediate to advanced trainees comes out of a bottle or a vial, and I'm not talking about creatine pills. But stay natty, Jeff and Stephanie at least get that right. On page 66, under the heading Volume, they give a rationale for the insanely high volumes. When it comes to per week volume, James Krieger recommends an absolute minimum of 10 sets per week per muscle group, but Dr. Brett Contreras recommends upwards of 30 sets. Let's start with the first reference, which is to Schoenfeld et al.'s dose-response relationship between weekly resistance training volume and increases in muscle mass, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Jeff and Stephanie write that one of the authors, James Krieger, and I quote, recommends an absolute minimum of 10 sets per week per muscle group. I ask, an absolute minimum for what? Any muscle growth? Half of your potential weekly growth? Optimal growth? Jeff and Stephanie are unclear, but the authors of the paper aren't. Under the heading Practical Applications, they tentatively write that greater than or equal to 10 weekly sets are required for optimal growth. But they also write that more research on the impacts of volume on growth is needed, and that substantial hypertrophic gains can be made with fewer than or equal to just 4 hard sets per week. Worth mentioning is that the authors also point out that there is certainly a threshold beyond which hypertrophic adaptations plateau and perhaps even regress due to overtraining. How Jeff and Stephanie got from greater than or equal to 10 weekly sets for optimal growth to their prescription of 54 weekly sets for the glutes is simply beyond me. But maybe it has something to do with the second reference, where they write, but Dr. Brett Contreras recommends upwards of 30 sets. When I visited the source myself, reference 28, I found out that Jeff and Stephanie are time travelers, accessing Brett's 2014 article a full 4 years before it was published. Anyway, this argument of Jeff and Stephanie's, such as it is merely an appeal to authority. That is, just because some expert recommends something doesn't mean that the recommendation is right. But it also so happens that I'm pretty familiar with Brett Contreras' work. I actually own his book, Glute Lab. I have a hard copy in the next room. And I've never seen him give volume recommendations for cookie-cutter glute emphasis routines that are anywhere even remotely close to the 54 weekly sets that Jeff and Stephanie prescribe. Brett has even written on his Instagram that he prescribes 36 sets on average for his female clients. His clients. People whom he can oversee and manage directly. Some might say too directly. Jeff and Stephanie prescribe a full 18 more hard sets than Brett's average for personal clients, with a blanket recommendation of 54 hard glute sets for intermediate to advanced women in the general population a week. Beyond these two references, they give no reason for why they've made the glutes volume so absurdly high. They don't provide any evidence supporting their decision for 54 weekly sets of glutes, because there is none. At least none that's any good. So much for backed by science in all caps. When I first looked at this program, a lot of things jumped out at me as silly. However, of the various silly things, the upper body workouts actually weren't among them. I remember looking at the upper body workouts and thinking, these are actually quite rational. Why couldn't the whole program have been designed rationally, like this? And then it hit me. I've actually seen these upper body workouts before. And before I show you how the upper body training looks in the program, so you can decide for yourself whether or not it's plagiarized, let's do a quick primer on plagiarism. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines plagiarism as the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. So crucially, plagiarism doesn't just have to be verbatim copying. My alma mater, Melbourne University, considers not just copying, but also inadequate paraphrasing, uncited quotes, and copying the skeleton or overall structure of someone else's work to be plagiarism. I can give an example of how plagiarism might look in the fitness industry. Consider some generic program like Mark Rippetoe's Starting Strength. If I took his program, slightly adjusted the exercises, replaced the power cleans with barbell rows, added in a dumbbell lateral raise, and then tried to pass the program off as entirely my own, without acknowledging Mark Rippetoe, then that'd be plagiarism. because despite the small changes I've made, the overall similarities are enough to say that it's been copied. Like, the order of exercises is the same, the A-B rotation is the same, the sequence of exercises is the same, there are 3 full body days a week, etc. And coupled with the fact that I haven't given acknowledgement to Mark, this would be a clear example of plagiarism. But if instead I said something like, here's my program, it's based on Mark's, I wrote it because Mark's program, for all its virtues, fails in the following several ways, then that wouldn't be plagiarism, since I've given acknowledgement to the original source, that being Mark Ripeto's starting strength. Having clarified that, let's come back to the upper body workouts in Jeff and Stephanie's program. So there are 2 upper body workouts per week. Now, let's look at the October 2018 iteration of the upper body workouts in Lyle McDonald's generic bulking routine, also done twice a week. There are a lot of similarities. There are 2 workouts per week. They follow the exact same sequence of exercises, that being push-pull, side delt, rear delt, biceps, triceps. The sequence is the exact same, even down to the arguably inconsistent decision to write biceps isolation before triceps isolation at the end of the workout. Surely biceps should go second, not first, given that pushing muscles are hitherto always trained first in this program. They both have the exact same total number of exercises, barring the extra rear delts exercise that's thrown in on workout 1. They both have the exact same training volumes on average for compound pushing and pulling. For this program, 13 weekly sets for pushing and pulling a piece, which is the exact same as what Lyle's program prescribes on average. The side and rear delts volume is almost exactly the same. Compare Jeff and Stephanie's 15 weekly sets to Lyle's 16. The biceps and triceps training also averages out to be the exact same, with Jeff and Stephanie's weekly total being 5 sets and Lyle's also averaging out to be exactly 5 sets. Yes, there are some differences. Jeff and Stephanie took some creative liberties in the following ways. Number 1, instead of the compound pushing mainly being chest pressing, they mainly made it overhead pressing, which I guess makes sense for a program that emphasizes the deltoid muscles. 2, they changed the rep ranges, mainly making them higher, which only makes the program worse. Yes, Jeff and Stephanie do prescribe supersets, but even that isn't a substantive difference, since Lyle has argued for years that antagonist supersets are fine and even beneficial to incorporate in his generic bulking routine. The 3rd and final substantive departure from Lyle's program only serves to make the second upper body workout worse in the form of the 7-7-7 delts training, where instead of doing straight sets, you do 7 partial reps in the bottom half of the range of motion, then 7 partial reps at the top half of the range of motion, and then 7 full range of motion reps. And that's 1 7-7-7 set. This is silly because the bottom part of the range of motion on a lateral raise, like right here, it doesn't even train the side delts. It trains the supraspinatus, which you can't even see since it's a rotator cuff muscle. So why would you do anything in a physique program that explicitly emphasizes the bottom portion of a lateral raise? For a science-based program, I don't see much anatomical justification here. Could these similarities be a complete coincidence? Well, I guess that's possible. However, worth pointing out is that Jeff and Stephanie released their program around February 2019, roughly 3 months after Lyle wrote his article about training volume, where he shared his updated generic bulking routine. And does Jeff know of Lyle's work? Well, the answer is yes, since Jeff interviewed Lyle in 2016, used to post on Lyle's Facebook group, and he linked Lyle's website in the description of his interview.
So this week I've got Lyle McDonald on the line. So Lyle is probably one of 2 or 3 guys that I recommend weekly, almost daily, to people who want to learn more about the science of training, nutrition, and supplementation. And his blog, bodyrecomposition.com, is a resource that I just can't really overstate the value of.
That Jeff should give such a glowing acknowledgement to Lyle and his work in the past, back in March 2016, makes it all the more weird that Lyle and his website go unmentioned in the women's specialization program. When Brett Contreras and his website are mentioned, James Krieger is mentioned, Brad Schoenfeld is mentioned, etc. And Lyle's influence on the upper body training seems so strong, stronger than any of the other names Jeff mentions. Now, when it comes to accusations of plagiarism in the fitness industry, the way it's often handled by those suspected is to say, well, it's only natural that my program would have things in common with someone else's. Because sound programs will inevitably have things in common, otherwise the programs just wouldn't work. Quite in fact, this is the exact same defense that Greg O'Gallagher, better known by his online handle Kinobody, raised when Martin Birkin, formerly Greg's coach, accused Greg of plagiarizing his reverse pyramid training scheme and intermittent fasting and all of the other lean gains things. And in isolation, I have no issue with this line of reasoning. It is unreasonable to expect people in the fitness industry to keep generating wholly original training programs just to avoid plagiarism. Because there's stuff that works and stuff that doesn't, and in trying not to stray too far from what works, undoubtedly there will be overlap with someone else's material. But what I have a problem with is when due credit isn't given, even when the overlap is conspicuous, like it is between the upper body workouts in Jeff and Stephanie's program and Lyle's program. And just because Lyle calls his routine generic doesn't mean it's any more acceptable to omit acknowledgement. Had Jeff and Stephanie mentioned Lyle or his website just once in their program, I wouldn't call what they've done plagiarism. But they didn't. Instead, it's as if they're trying to pass it off as if it's entirely their own work. And it seems unfair that Lyle's hard work, which he put out online for free, mind you, has more or less been copied and used for profit by Jeff and Stephanie, without so much as even a passing mention. And giving some acknowledgement isn't too much to ask of Jeff and Stephanie. It's the bare minimum. People in the fitness industry can and do give due acknowledgement to their source material when writing programs. Even folks far less educated than Jeff and Stephanie. For instance, when Matt Ogus wrote his 753 program, he gave a nod to Jim Wendler's 531 and explained why he made his alterations to it. When Johnny Payne wrote his Grayskull linear progression routine, he gave a nod to Mark Ribito's starting strength and explained why he made his alterations. I read his book. But Jeff and Stephanie don't. It all just seems a bit shabby to me. And, one last thing. On page 58, I think they mean to write tenet, not tenant. Unless perhaps there is someone by the name of Periodic Variation who happens to live at the address Periodization and Program Design. But I couldn't find it on the map. Overall, Jeff Nippard and Stephanie Buttermore's women's specialization program is terrible. Yes, the upper body workouts are all right, whether or not they were plagiarized from Lyle. However, the lower body workouts are terrible due to the abundance of junk volume and the fact that they confuse more with better. They confuse more with better with respect to the excessively high volume, frequency, and rep ranges. And, to top it all off, counter to the program's advertising, not only does the program waste time with its inbuilt junk volume, it isn't even evidence-based. If you bought this program because you were sucked in by Jeff and Stephanie's marketing rhetoric, then I feel for you. If Jeff and Stephanie won't accept my feedback in private, then they leave me no choice but to go public with it. Because owing to their reputations and huge followings, Jeff and Stephanie do enormous harm when they screw up, as they've done here. Anyway, that concludes this video. I write personalized sample muscle and strength programs for people. I offer hour-long video consultations, daily text and email check-ins, that sort of thing. If that interests you, then get in touch via the email address on screen. I do charge, but my clients tell me that they get good value. Like and subscribe for more.